Okay, so let's continue with the fed batch system, right? So this is the schematic representation of operating a bioreactor in a fed batch system. So till now what we have discussed in our earlier classes, we are dealing with the bioreactors and their mode of operation. We are having a look at how we can operate these bioreactor. First we had a look at batch mode of operation. Continuing with that, we will start with fed batch mode of operation. So only difference between the batch mode and fed batch mode operation here is we have a feed tank which is connected to the bioreactor. This remaining part is exactly the same. We have the reactor, we have the airflow in, sterile airflow in, and we have the sterile airflow out or unwanted gases flow out which has been sterilized. And only modification for the batch system we are doing here is connecting a feed tank. So this is called a feed tank which is connected to a pump. This, with the help of this pump, we are going to send the feed into the bioreactor. So this is called fed batch mode of operation. So these are nothing but the feeding regimes. How we are going to feed the bioreactor. The first picture what you see is called variable feeding regime. That means we are going to vary the amount of feed that we are going to send into the bioreactor. So if you see here we have decreased the amount of feed that we are sending into the bioreactor and then slowly increase the amount of feed that is sent into the bioreactor. So why we are going to do like this is, why we are going to operate in this mode is, we are going to run the bioreactor based on the growth rate of the microorganisms. The growth rate is too high, we are going to send a less amount of substrate into the bioreactor. If the growth rate is too less or going down drastically, then we are going to increase the feed that we are sending into the bioreactor. This is one mode of operating the fed batch reactor. And the second mode of operation is called as continuous feeding regime. So here in this graph B, we are slowly sending the substrate at minimal concentration continuously into the bioreactor. This is also one way of operating in a fed batch mode of bioreactor. And the third one is called intermittent feeding mode. So here, if you have a look at this graph, we are feeding at time intervals, at different time intervals. We are going to give a break and then we will send the feed again. So such kind of feeding is called intermittent feeding regime. And the next mode or the final mode is called incremental feeding regime. So in this feeding regime, we are gradually increasing the amount of substrate that we are sending into the bioreactor from lower concentration to higher concentration. And why we are doing here this mode is because we need to accommodate the organism growth by increasing the amount of substrate that we are sending into the bioreactor. So initially we have less amount of organisms that are going inside the bioreactor, and slowly with the time the organism count will vary or organism count will increase. So we need to accommodate more amount of substrate, send more amount of substrate into the bioreactor. This is also one strategy of operating in a fed batch mode. So let's have a look at what are the advantages of the fed batch mode operation of the bioreactor. First major advantage is controlling the concentration of limiting substrate, prevent the repressive effects of substrates. So as we discussed in the earlier class, high substrate concentration always will have a repressive effect on the growth of the organism as well as the product formation. So in order to avoid that, rather than giving high initial substrate concentration to the organism, what we are doing here is we are slowly sending the feed so that we can avoid the repressive effects of the high initial concentration. That's one major advantage why we operate bioreactors in fed batch mode. Second one is careful feeding strategy. The organism's growth rate and subsequent oxygen demand can be controlled. So we all know that higher the growth rate of the microorganisms, higher will be the oxygen requirements by the microorganisms. So what we can do is we can balance these two, amount of growth and amount of oxygen requirements by the microorganisms by doing the careful feeding strategy that is in fed batch mode. So this plays a crucial role. This balancing the growth and the oxygen supply plays a crucial role in the biomass production of yeast. So when you are culturing microorganisms for biomass production, so there is always higher amount of oxygen that is required, and if you don't have a look at how much amount of dissolved oxygen that is there, it will eventually leads to autolysis of the cells. So we can careful feeding strategy, we can control both growth rate as well as the oxygen demand. Next one, we will be able to achieve high cell densities. So if you are looking at a biomass based product, if you are looking at production of product at higher concentration, then we can go with a fed batch system. We can get at least 10 times higher biomass rates than what you get with a conventional batch mode of operation. So with the fed batch system, we can get at least 10 times higher mode of biomass based products than the fed batch system. Next major advantage, increased production of non-growth related products or the secondary products, right? So we discuss what is growth related products and what is non-growth related products. Growth related products are the products which require organisms different stages of growth. Non-growth related products are those which do not require the organisms different stages of growth. So if you are looking at non-growth related products, this can be produced in large quantities, like a secondary metabolites can be produced in large quantities, both with a batch as well as fed batch system. And reduction of broth viscosity also one major advantage. Why? Because by sending the feed in very dilute form, we can reduce the amount of viscosity of the media. So lower the viscosity, happily the organisms can grow and they can produce the products inside the reactor. So coming to downsides of this fed batch mode of operation. First major drawback is a detailed knowledge of organisms growth and product formation is essential. So if you want to culture the organisms in a fed batch mode, you need to have a detailed knowledge of how the growth patterns of the organism. So how many days it's going to reach log phase, how many hours it's going to reach stationary phase, and how long it can grow with the one type of substrate. All these things we should know beforehand before we start a fed batch mode. Second major drawback is deficiency of reliable online sensors. So as I said, we mostly look at fed batch system for biomass based products. So if you want to find out how much amount of carbon source is remaining inside the bioreactor, or how much amount of nitrogen source is remaining inside the bioreactor, how much amount of limiting substrate is there inside the bioreactor, there are no biosensors right now to directly determine from the bioreactor. We need to take a sample out from the bioreactor and we have to manually calculate the biomass levels from the with the help of some analytical tools. But there are no reliable online sensors which can directly give the information or the data regarding the carbon sources or the nitrogen sources or any other parameters like biomass levels that is going on inside the bioreactor. That's one major drawback of disadvantage of fed batch system. Next one is without feedback control, there can be a mismatch between the feed rate and culture metabolism. So without understanding all these things, let's say you don't know how the culture organisms inside your batch system grows. You don't know what type of substrate you have sent and that substrate will long for how many days. Without knowing, let's say you have sent large quantities of substrate again by fed batching. Then what happens? Then higher amount of substance this time can have a repressive effect. That's one. That one thing can happen. Or let's say you don't know how the organism is growing, and you think that organism is going fine, and without knowing the feedback, you send less amount of feed into the bioreactor. Then what happens? Organisms may get washed out because of lack of substrate. So without feedback control, we cannot operate these fed batch system. That's one major drawback. And the operator who is going to handle this fed batch system has to be highly trained one. That's also one major drawback. I'll wind up here. I'll continue with the continuous culturing systems in the next session. Thank you.